The way that they tell the story of Jesus is close enough to what we know about Judaism in the first century that they're not obviously nonsense made up and mad.
Should we be imagining, as a very popular TV program does, one of many ways, has the evangelist with a little notepad?
It is broadly agreed by New Testament scholars.
What advice would you give to a Catholic who comes across passages that seem to contradict from one gospel to the next?
Honestly, the advice I would give, it might have been that at the very beginning of Christianity, people were thinking, well, Jesus is coming back any minute now, so you don't need to write stuff down because we can all still remember it.
The 4 different gospels, what are the characters of each that you would say to focus on?
That's a really good question.
Are the Gospels reliable witnesses to the life of Jesus Christ?
Well, yes, I think they are. Obviously, I think they are, or I wouldn't be doing what I do.
I'm glad we got that clear.
So what do we mean when we say reliable? They are not obviously unbiased historical documents. The Gospels are written, the Gospel of John, for example, says explicitly, things have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, and believing have life in his name. So they are propaganda documents, for want of a better expression. Christians accept the Gospels because they testify to their faith, but that doesn't mean that we're all kind of living in a fantasy world. If you actually look at the Scriptures and the Gospels and try to imagine reading them as an unbeliever, I don't think that's a bad thing to do, provided you remember that you're pretending that you're an unbeliever and not, as some biblical scholars do, just carry on pretending you're an unbeliever until you retire. What you can notice is that they have very much the kinds of features you would expect of documents that come out of eyewitness testimony. In the case of 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and John, they purport to be written by apostles. Mark and Luke, not so. Luke, we don't know exactly who Luke was, but he seems to have been a companion of St. Paul. Mark, by tradition, is the son-in-law of St. Peter, and it's often thought that Mark's Gospel bears witness especially to the way that Peter told the story. It's often noted that the Gospels are different from one another, and sometimes, even in small ways, for the most part, contradict one another. This is exactly what you would expect, in fact, of eyewitness testimony. If you look at studies that have been done of people bearing witness to things that they've seen, road accidents or stabbings or whatever it might be, you find that there are fairly substantial differences between the accounts of 2 completely honest eyewitnesses. Firstly, then, I think they look like eyewitness testimony. Secondly, they bear witness to a shared faith, so that what they say chimes with the experience that Christians today have of their life in the church and of their own personal relationship with Jesus, so that the Jesus that the Gospels speak of is in some ways a very familiar Christ, not just because we're very familiar with the stories, but because this is the Christ that is preached by the church. At the same time, the Gospels are in some ways strikingly unfamiliar. One of the things I often do with my students when I'm teaching them the Gospels is get them to read St. Mark's Gospel as if for the first time. For some of them, I think it is for the first time. And not to read anything else, just to sit and read through St. Mark's Gospel and then write an essay. What surprises you? What shocks you? What's there that you didn't think would be there? What isn't there that you thought would be there? And that can be a really interesting and useful experience for them. The other thing I think it's worth saying is that the Gospels seem to have exactly the right amount of difference in 2 directions. The way that they tell the story of Jesus is close enough to what we know about Judaism in the first century that they're not obviously nonsense made up and mad. they make sense coming out of that background, if you will, but at the same time they're sufficiently different that you can see there was some point to writing these stories. It isn't just a seamless flow. Jesus clearly comes as a shock, if you like, as one would expect. And in the same way, the Gospels are sufficiently similar to what we know about the faith of the early church that we can see how that faith emerged from the life of Jesus that the Gospels relates. But at the same time, they're sufficiently different that I think it doesn't make sense to say that the Gospels have simply been invented to justify the beliefs of the early church. So we call this the criterion of double dissimilarity, which is also a good name for a band. But in fact, what you have is double dissimilarity and double similarity in, to my mind, just the right degree that it's exactly what you would expect if you didn't know what to expect, if you see what I mean.
Yes, I think so. Just to ask a bit more about the idea of eyewitness testimony, should we be imagining that, as a very popular TV program does, one of many ways, has the evangelist with a little notepad scribbling down notes following Jesus?
Chosen.
Indeed,
yes.
Which is wonderful. But is that the kind of idea of eyewitness testimony, or what sort of time do we think elapsed between the apostles and disciples in the early church experiencing the life of Christ and then choosing to write these things down?
Right, good. I think, firstly, it is broadly agreed by New Testament scholars that the first of the Gospels to be written was that of St. Mark. When is this written? I mean, it's very hard to put a date on it, but I would say probably sometime in the 60s, roughly. So you're talking about 30 years after the resurrection of Christ. And then the others sometime after that. Matthew and Luke both look like they used Mark's Gospel as a literary source.
In very brief terms, why do biblical scholars come to that conclusion about the 60s? What are the sorts of factors involved?
Well, I mean, it's a good question because there really aren't any hard and fast kind of rules. We talk about the terminus post quem and the terminus ante quem because nothing really means anything unless you say it in Latin or German if you're doing biblical scholarship. The terminus post quem is like the earliest date it must have been written or could have been written, and the terminus post quem is the last date after which it couldn't have been written. Both of those are really hard to put a number on, actually, with Mark. Genuinely, there's nothing intrinsic to Mark's Gospel that means it couldn't have been written in the 30s. It could, in principle, have been written in the 70s, except that I think that doesn't give you very much time for the other Gospels then to use it and have been written before we start to get copies of them. So 60s, honestly, now I think about it, it's a compromise. We really don't know. But let's say, because it seems not implausible, that the best part of a generation has passed between the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, and somebody thinking to themselves, well, I better write this stuff down. And that makes sense because it might have been that at the very beginning of Christianity, people were thinking, well, Jesus is coming back any minute now, so you don't need to write stuff down because we can all still remember it. It's only when the earliest generation of Christians who actually knew Jesus are starting to die, maybe, this is only a theory, people thought we'd better write this down so that later generations can get this just in case he doesn't come back quite as quickly as maybe we thought he would. But in any case, what you've then got is a process of what we like to call oral tradition, people telling stories. And I think the eyewitness testimony makes its way into the oral tradition, and then it makes its way into the written narrative. Now, that doesn't mean that the written narratives aren't, in at least those two cases, written by or substantially written by eyewitnesses themselves, but those are eyewitnesses who have been telling the story for 30, 40 years until they're old men, and listening to other people tell their stories as well. And everybody has a different story because everybody's relationship with Jesus is unique. So even eyewitness testimony that then goes into writing is filtered through the oral tradition. So it's quite a complicated process, I would imagine. And even more complicated once you start to use other people's writings to make your own, as Matthew and Luke probably did.
And in reading the Gospels, what advice would you give to a Catholic who comes across passages that seem to contradict from one Gospel to the next, say different versions of the parables, or classic example being the Passover and the crucifixion and the order in which things happen?
Yeah, the Passover, the timing of the death of Jesus in relation to the Passover is really, really hard. There are ways around it so that you can kind of make sense of it, but they're quite hard to understand. You've got to explain a lot about lunar calendars and solar calendars and when the day begins and when the day ends and all that kind of thing. And honestly, the advice I would give to a Catholic reading the scriptures for the first time is don't worry too much about the timing of it. Be more interested in the point that the biblical author is trying to make, which is a theological point first and foremost. When it comes to other things, you mentioned, for example, different versions of the parables. It would be amazing to me if Jesus thought of a parable and then only used it once. If when I've thought of something good to say, I will say it as often as I possibly can to as many different people as I possibly can to get the most out of it. And different versions of it emerge in different places to different people and so on. Surely the same thing is perfectly likely. So different evangelists write down different parables that they like, or different versions of parables that Jesus preached on different occasions. I don't think that's particularly problematic. There are inconsistencies, yes, but they're fairly minor for the most part. And as I said, they're mostly the kinds of inconsistencies that we would look for in eyewitness testimony, especially when it's passed down through the oral tradition. I don't think it should trouble anybody that therefore this can't be true, because they are fairly minor.
In terms of the four different Gospels, just very briefly, what are the characters of each that you would say to focus on in terms of why things might be different between them?
That's a really good question. So St. Mark's Gospel, as I say, I think the first to be written, though it's not the first canonically, St. Mark's Gospel really focuses on the weirdness of Jesus. That's how I see it. Jesus Christ is this entirely Jewish figure, makes sense within first century Judaism as an apocalyptic prophet, but he is odd. He's unnerving, unsettling. And I think St. Mark's Gospel is all about presenting us with this unsettling figure who remarkably gives us the clearest possible picture of the face of God. I think St. Matthew's Gospel is much more concerned with how Christ is the fulfillment of the scriptures, and in particular, how Christ is the end of the law in both senses of the word end. St. Luke's is the most historically conscious gospel. St. Luke is very clearly in his own mind a proper historian, but at the same time very keen to show how Jesus Christ is the prophet that was promised by Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. St. John's is everybody's favourite gospel, surely. It's the gospel of the beloved disciple. It's the gospel of a man who lay in the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper, the gospel of a man who stood at the foot of the cross, the gospel of a man who knew that Jesus loved him and wants to bear witness to what it was like to be loved by the man who is God.